Moving on to our next speaker this evening, it's a real honour to introduce to you Peter Ford, former UK ambassador to Syria. Peter brings with him this evening a unique perspective to share with you, having lived and worked in Syria as a member of the Foreign Office. Peter discusses his experiences in appearing in mainstream media, and he's one of those rare people that's actually managed to get a counter-narrative heard, having appeared on the BBC and Sky. Please give a warm welcome to Peter Ford.
Thank you. First of all, a declaration of interest. I am co-chair of the British Syrian Society. There, I've said it. It's out there. The Daily Telegraph can't smear me again, as they tried to do a few months ago. Because I had become a member of the British Syrian Society, they put in a story in their rag to the effect that the former British ambassador was on the Syrian government payroll. Fake news, a total fabrication and a smear, and I forced them to print a correction. They were clever. They have lawyers, of course, so in the small print of the story they said, we have no proof that former Ambassador Ford is actually being remunerated, but we're going to go ahead and give that impression anyway. Well, I don't get one penny for voicing my opinions about Syria or anything else. I say what I say because that's what I feel. And that is not true of most of the talking heads that you will see in the mainstream media talking about Syria. Most of them are on somebody's payroll, and it's usually, if it's not the British government or the American government, it's on the payroll of one of the Gulf countries. But they are rarely, if ever, asked to declare an interest. The reason the Daily Telegraph tried to smear me was that over the last 12 months, I had a little bit of success in voicing an alternative opinion about Syria. I managed to secure appearances as a so-called expert on breakfast shows, BBC, ITV, Sky. This was when especially Aleppo was top of the news. So the British government and the Daily Telegraph couldn't bear to hear an alternative voice being heard. So they tried to undermine me. But Aleppo is actually a very important case to consider here because of the prominence that the whole story of Aleppo was given compared to the prominence that was given to the equally, if not more serious, siege in Mosul. That Iraqi city was besieged for months on end. The numbers of civilians fleeing the city or killed or injured was far greater than the equivalent numbers in Aleppo. But did our mainstream media put Mosul top of the news for months on end? Of course not. Did they give much coverage at all to the hospitals in Mosul that were bombed? Barely a word. Did they, on the other hand, give prominent coverage to the fact that the jihadi fighters were ISIS? And did we not see endless pictures of those ISIS people whenever there was a bit of coverage about Mosul? But there was, in the case of Aleppo, the opposition, the rebels, were virtually invisible. They were airbrushed from the pictures. We rarely, if ever, saw any of the people who had actually been controlling the civilian population of Aleppo for about 3 years. The closest we got was when we saw the notorious white helmets, those auxiliaries of the jihadis. And we will hear more about them very shortly from Vanessa. We also saw the citizen journalists, also auxiliaries of the jihadis, with miraculously wonderful Wi-Fi connections when nobody in Aleppo, other than them, could get a signal. They had better signal than me in Manchester. Of course, because they were in Istanbul or southern Turkey. Fake news. But the main point I want to emphasize here is that the Western media, by selection of what they reckon is important, of what Western governments reckon is important, by giving this prominence, they make you think that something really big is going on here and something really heinous, really terrible is going on here. But when they want to downplay something, like the suffering in Mosul, well, the obedient media just take their cue from whatever government spokesmen are saying. A special word, not of praise, but of condemnation for defense correspondents here. Defense correspondents are the worst of the worst, I think. First of all, what a wonderful Orwellian name, defense correspondent. It's like the Ministry of Defense, which used to be known as the War Ministry. The Ministry of Defense is just the War Ministry with a better publicity agent. And this is what Western governments do, not defense, attack. Successively, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, etc. But defense correspondents invariably quote sources, usually unnamed, the spoon-fed stories by the Ministry of Defense or the Pentagon, and they present it uncritically, virtually without exception. Whenever I see a story which is bylined by a defense correspondent, I reach for my gun, as it were. So defense correspondents, you should beware. The other, I just stressed how important the selection of subjects is by the media and the ignoring or downplaying of others. That's one of the weapons of mass deception that the mainstream media use. Another is forgive me, the choice is so great, and I don't want to repeat what's already been said by others. But slant and distortion is, of course, another favorite technique, the use of emotive or misleading vocabulary, the constant reference to the moderates in Syria, never defined, and apparently applied to basically any group which will accept Western arms and Western direction. But most of the mainstream media will simply regurgitate this. And there is no questioning of the extensive aid that the British government have been giving to these so-called moderates. It was recently revealed in Parliament that the British taxpayer has donated more than £200 million in a period of 3 years to the Syrian armed opposition. Think about that when you get your next paycheck and you see the tax that's been taken out. £200 million. And much of it has been for propaganda. They call it information training. The kind of thing that you've seen on screen, that's the kind of information training they get. How to fake news and manipulate us, manipulate public opinion. I want to turn to something a bit controversial now, and the way we're manipulated over terrorism, how we are served a story here. Whenever there is a terrorist incident in this country, the media always present it in the same inadequate way, without context. They give us in more detail than we really want to have about the injuries, about the techniques, about the risk of it happening again. But you will wait in vain for any commentator to address the question of why. Why is it happening? What's the motivation? It's presented as though, well, it was like a hurricane or an earthquake, stuff that just happens. No examination of how actions by us or by our elected representatives might have produced blowback. Obviously, I'm not condoning, on the contrary, totally deplore the vile acts of ISIS, but these are acts of revenge. They are bombing us because we've been bombing them in Iraq and Syria. The truth is out. But you'll wait in vain to hear that from the mainstream media. No, they will present every incident, and I guarantee it will be the same with the next one, the inevitable next one. It will be presented like a forensic crime scene. All they're interested in, all they want you to think about are the victims, the methodology, who done it, and will they do it again, but not why did it happen, and do actions have consequences? Do the actions of our government not bear some responsibility for what is happening? I would have respect for Mrs. May if after one of these incidents she said, look, I know it's dreadful what's happening, but I really think that our sacrifices, or rather your sacrifices, Londoners, are worth it, because that's the decision we've taken. But no, the government doesn't even try to address that question of whether the sacrifices are worth it, and the media never call the government to account. Mark my words, the next time it happens. Another of the techniques used by the government and echoed by the media, which are often just an extension of the apparatus of state, is personalization, simplification. So Assad is almost invariably described as Assad the dictator, Assad the butcher, Assad who is massacring his people. It's all personalized, so nobody has to actually look at the complexities of the Syrian conflict and try to understand that at its core, this conflict is one between the forces of secularism and the forces of hardline militant Islam. No, much easier to call Assad a dictator. No need to examine the circumstances of Syria and adjust our own approach accordingly. I'm not going, time presses, so I'm going to conclude with a word of mitigation. Some in the mainstream media will say we're not giving them any credit for some of the useful stories that challenging the government that they do carry. Channel 4 has been in the van of those who have been hostile to Syria, but on Yemen, they've done a lot of good reports, and they deserve credit for that. But let's be honest here, it doesn't require great courage on the part of a journalist to attack the British government over Yemen, which is not a central issue in British public opinion or foreign policy, and it has a villain, Saudi Arabia, that almost everybody loves to hate. So it's not that courageous. To be fair, Channel 4 have recently started to be more objective in their reporting about Syria. Well, it was high time. That's all I can say. So I will conclude on a hopeful note that maybe we are beginning to see the start of slightly more balanced reporting about Syria. We're starting to see some questioning of American motives in particular. We must be thankful to President Trump for having forced us to question American policy on Iran. Even the European countries have joined the opposition to what Trump wants to do on Iran. So there is some hope, but in the meanwhile, please continue to monitor the alternative media, and particularly Patrick's 21st Century Wire. Thank you.